Any institution that continues year after year tends to perpetuate itself, and we forget to ask the question why the institution exists. It's a question that any member of an ongoing institution has trouble asking, because we're always afraid of the answer. We're always afraid that if we answer the question honestly, we'll decide the institution doesn't have a reason for existing anymore, and whether it's a college fraternity or an army, a missionary society, or the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, we have to be a little bit worried about the answer we're going to get. In the case of Bread Loaf, the question, why does the institution exist, has to mean, why should anyone pay $300-some-odd to come to Bread Loaf and listen to some writers talk?
Sometime in the 1870s, a young man named Joseph Battelle came to Vermont and bought this lovely upland bowl. He built the Bread Loaf Inn and the attendant summer cottages, and began to raise Morgan horses. As a matter of fact, he became the stud keeper of the Morgan Registry and established not only the Upland Inn, but something like $30,000 of virgin forest, which he bought around the periphery. And sometime around 1920, he bequeathed this property to Middlebury College. Here, Middlebury established what it calls its mountain campus, and from about June, the 1st of July, I should say, to about the middle of August every year, the Bread Loaf School of English meets in these buildings. Beginning in about 1921. When the School of English started, Robert Frost, a near neighbor, he lived about a mile down the mountain, was almost the patron saint of the school. He noticed that the best 2 weeks of the summer, the last 2 weeks of August, went by without this lovely mountain inn being used, and suggested to Middlebury College that perhaps it should call some writers together to see, as he put it, if maybe some ideas didn't rub off. From that suggestion, the Bread Loaf Writers Conference was born, and today there are something like 100 writers' conferences in the United States, some overseas, some as far away as Baguio in the Philippines, all in one way or another descended from Robert Frost's original idea and from the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. Bread Loaf, the Writers Conference, meets in these buildings for 2 weeks each year, from about the middle of August to just before Labor Day. And I think we are remaining faithful to Robert Frost's idea of bringing writers together to see if they can rub off an idea on one another. The conference schedule is an interesting one. We begin by calling together something like 200 writers, would-be writers, hopeful writers. Sometimes a hopeless writer gets into the bunch. But there are also a number of people known as auditors. The auditors are largely, I think, people interested in writing. Many of them are school teachers who are interested in writing but have never heard writing spoken about from the inside. We try to correct a tendency for them by bringing together a staff. This year we have 14 people on the staff of the most competent writers we can find. The writers, moreover, have to be articulate people and reasonably sympathetic ones. During the first week of each conference, these writers lecture, if lecture is the word for it. Actually, they present themselves to the conference members and try to say as honestly as they know how what happens when they face a blank sheet of paper, how to gather one's forces for facing that sheet of paper, and what happens then. While they are lecturing during that first week, they are also reading manuscripts submitted by a group of contributors. The contributors make up about 50% of the conference, which is to say there are about 100 of them. Their manuscripts are read. During the second week, each contributor has a conference with his particular staff member. Among the contributors, a very special group, and one very important to us, are a number of waiters, usually about 20, who are generally college students who are working their way through the Bread Loaf Conference as working scholars. And because of an endowment fund that we have underway, there are usually from 10 to 18 fellows and scholars who come to Bread Loaf with all expenses paid. The fellows are generally the more advanced writers. A fellow must have published at least one book or have its equivalent in magazine publication or have a book underway that is ready for publication with a standard author. These meet, listen to the principles expounded in the first week of lectures. Then in the second week, following the same schedule, they meet again in what are called workshops. In these workshops, the staff tries to apply, again, as best it can, the principles it tried to expound in the first week and to illustrate them by samples from the manuscripts that have been read, which is to say by samples of the work of the contributors. At that point, everyone is entitled to join into the discussion and to give his opinion, sometimes a good one, sometimes a random one, but by exposure to the rest of the group, I think something does happen in this process. It's difficult to describe. Sometimes in New York, when I'm trying to explain to a would-be staff member what happens at Bread Loaf, I say, there's a kind of magic about it, and the answer I get is magic schmagic. What are you trying to sell me? But it is a sort of magic, I think, largely because Bread Loaf is a sort of landlocked cruise in which everyone is intensely concerned about the same thing and without interruption from the outside. This is the second week of the conference. We have a clinic underway right now.
Well, I have here not a book, but a short story, and I'd like to give you just a little background on it. I spoke with the contributor concerning something she had written which dealt with life with a man who had had a stroke. It came from personal experience. She had a great deal of knowledge about it, and there was no question but that everything she said was completely authentic. It was interesting, too. However, I pointed out that there were possibly three things that she had in mind in dealing with this. In the first place, there was the semi-medical attitude of how one treats a man with a stroke, the man being her husband, by the way. The other was a character study of the husband. The third, perhaps, was the manner in which love deepened under difficulties. You had the semi-technical one, the character study, the love story, and I suggested that as practice, she write all three, perhaps, but not mix them up to the point where not one of the three was very clearly in view. She followed my suggestion, and she decided to write the character study, handed it in, and to begin with, the title is The Man Who Never Said Can't. And now this, remember, this is essentially, in a way, a non-fiction piece. She's describing how one lives with the victim of a stroke. And of course, I'm entirely too stupid to make marks on this. I have this hatred for making marks on someone else's manuscript. She is trying to teach him to speak. They had told her he would never speak. Gordon and I were not willing to accept the verdict, so we worked daily at speech. I encouraged him to talk, to say whatever came out. Twice a day we sat across the table from each other with a mirror and a pencil and paper in front of us. We started with vowels. I said A and wrote A on the paper. He looked at my mouth and tried to put his in the same position by looking in the mirror and wrote A on his paper. Gradually, we went through the vowels, from those he could do to those he couldn't, adding another sound or syllable when possible, from O to door, from ah to water. Even while exercising, we continued. I said up, down. He said no, no. While exercising one day, we finally had a breakthrough. Instead of no, no, Gordon's words were up, down. This after 6 months of daily constant practice. We were delighted and worked harder than ever. It wasn't long until Gordon could repeat anything I said. Now we planned, like conspirators, to surprise the doctor. Gordon's next appointment was in the morning. He would learn to say good morning. We practiced constantly until he could say it at any time without prompting. As we waited for the doctor, Gordon's eyes sparkled. The door opened and the doctor walked in. "Good morning," said Gordon. The doctor stopped, speechless for a moment. "Why, good morning, Gordon. Now tell me about it. How did you learn to talk?" Why did you laugh? Why did you laugh? Yes.
It's anticlimactic, such a letdown. His response.
That's right. That's right. This, until the doctor comes in, this is my opinion too. Now maybe someone disagrees, but let me explain first and then we'll see if someone disagrees. My feeling was that after you build this up, and really it's a heroic struggle, and you get it across, You're so proud of Gordon, you're so proud of his wife, you're waiting with him for that doctor to come in. He says, "Good morning," and what you want the doctor to do is to fall right down in a faint. That's what you want him to do, right? Now, he doesn't. To say, "Good morning, Gordon, now tell me about it," coolly, doctor, no, not right away. We've got to have more fun at the expense of the doctor. We've got to use the doctor as a foil to show the great accomplishment of Gordon's. We've got to see through the doctor just what had been accomplished, and we have to feel a little bit of what Gordon must feel in his inarticulate way and of what his wife must feel. The author owes it to the reader. Naomi, you're a doctor. What do you think? What do you think?
I think that this passage was absolutely riotous, and it's so marvelous that if she changes one word of it, she's absolutely crazy. Because this physician has reacted exactly the way hundreds of millions of people react when confronted with a stroke, even though he is a physician. They temporarily forget, or perhaps they never knew, what a tremendous amount of work goes into reconstituting the simple things like saying good morning. Here's a physician, and he himself has come up with this perfectly idiotic response, which is so natural and so human and so typical. It's marvelous.
Okay, there was someone here who wanted to say something.
Well, if this is fiction, I can understand why you say don't be slavish to the facts.
Right.
But if it's nonfiction, I have a hard time. Now, let's say I'm the doctor reading this book later, and I suddenly see myself presented, and I say, well, that's not what I said. I said something else, and I go out and tell the cocktail party crowd what I really said, which seems to me that the moment you start fictionalizing your fiction, you really are running a chance that the whole thing can be discredited, can't you?
Now that's a very interesting point. Let me repeat. When the first version was brought to me, I said there were 3 elements, that she could even write it as 3 separate pieces, and she chose to write the character study. Now, there would also be a straight, almost entirely nonfiction method of presenting how one deals with a stroke. But this one is supposed to be the character study, and the question now arises, ought one to sacrifice the character of the doctor to the character of Gordon? Now, this is a decision that the author has to make for himself, usually, and the reaction may be different in different people. I know what I want, she knows what she wants, and heaven only knows which of us is correct. Nothing pleases everybody. This is something to remember. If you try to please everybody, you're going to have to write 1 million different versions. So in the end, you've got to write the one which seems right to yourself and hope for the best in many cases.
The real thing, though, that one comes to Bread Loaf for, and all that I've been saying has led up, I believe, to this. The real thing one comes to Bread Loaf for is the talk. Nowhere else I know of can people sit around as many hours a day as we do here, something like 32 or 40, and talk about writing. You're here with 200 or 300 people, all of whom are interested in what you're interested in. And if you're from a suburb of Dubuque and you see your neighbors, if you see them only in the A&P, and hardly any of them are interested in the short stories you're working on, it can get to be a pretty good thing at the end of the year to come to Bread Loaf or somewhere else and simply talk about writing. What we give you here are not rules you can carry home, but an impulse, something that will carry you through at least the next year, simply because you've been talked to and talked at and listened to and you've heard ideas. That's what Bread Loaf is for.
Okay. Let's look at this then. Let me read it. It's very small. The white man pressed the locks. Driving down the concrete vein, away from the smoky heart, through the darkening, blighted body, pausing at clotted arteries, the white man pressed the locks on all the sedan's doors, sped toward the white corpuscles in the white arms, hugging the black city. I chose it because I thought that it had a real unity, that the parts cohere. It does something that I like very much. It sustains one image throughout. Now, of course, it's a small poem, so it's perhaps not so hard to sustain it, but I could easily conceive of this poem having jumped from veins and hearts and arteries to some other image, which I think would have, kind of thrown it away. I think he does carry the parts of the body very nicely. The analogy between the city and the parts of the body, I think, is what makes the poem worthwhile. And there certainly is an energy in it. It's the energy of anger, isn't it, pretty much? I'd like to, ask how you feel about it. Is this poem an act of discovery, say, rather than an act of invention? Does it work for you? I'd like to invite some comments.
But is away supposed to be an action or a place, away from the smoky heart? Because if the vein is, it couldn't be the vein going away from the smoky heart, because the artery goes away from the heart.
Very sharp, very good. You've caught him in a real inaccuracy, because the venous blood is carried back to the heart to be replenished and then travels away from the heart. This is right straight out of 9th grade biology, and that's all I learned through the arteries.
This is pausing at clotted arteries.
Yeah. I think you've really caught him, don't you? Yeah.
Well, I think I like a lot of the, not a lot, but some of the adjectives cut out. I think the poem would have greater energy, greater force. For example, cut out blighted, perhaps, the darkening body, pausing at arteries, and cut out maybe one or two of the uses of white. It's used 3 times in very close proximity.
White? Did you say?
White man, and then white corpuscles, and then again white arms.
Yeah.
This is a mystery and a challenge. I think the impulse to repeat is a good, healthy musical impulse. I hope you heard in the Wallace Stevens the immense number of repetitions.
Yeah.
You have to decide whether they're all believable, whether as Blake says, the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. But sometimes the road of excess doesn't lead to the palace of wisdom.
Yeah, that's a bad preachment, I think, for all of us in this time and place. Because the diction of that Wallace Stevens poem that Bob read is exceeding plain, isn't it? And that's part of the magic of it and the music of it. I don't see how you could avoid in this poem saying white man, white arms, white corpuscles. I don't see how you could get away from that. I would be very much in favor of refining the image of darkening, blighted body, which I think is the least concrete, the least specific, and probably the most necessary image for the terrible blight of the city. I think that's the worst line in the poem.
I'd like to pick up on something Maxine said about the poem coming out of anger. I think that's probably true, and yet it doesn't seem to me, you know, anger that goes wild, anger that has no object. There's also a sense here of focus and control. Wallace Stevens, you know, speaks of a kind of poet that he likes to satirize, and he says, "And Ludwig Richter, that turbulent schlemiel, has lost the hole in which he was contained." You know, that's having a passion or an anger that finds no direction. He goes on to say, like the wind that lashes everything at once. You know, if you're going to be windy, you know, pick out the tree that you want to blow the leaves off.
Yeah, precisely. And this really, I think, is the heart of the poems under discussion this morning. How do you find that precarious balance between energy is all and you know, a kind of overblown polemic? How do you walk this narrow tightrope where a poem is a cry from the heart and expresses the outrage and the resentment and all of the sort of cauldron feelings that are implicit in this person, without just going over into didactic and windy fury and preachment? It's a very tough balance, and I think that hardly anybody has talked about what's going on in black poetry at the moment.
There are other things, I guess, that certainly be said for it. The atmosphere, I think, is conducive to thinking, insofar as lots of ideas will come to you because of the people who you're finally in contact with. From my point of view, the isolation that I experienced coming from Oregon was really, shall I say, modified here because of the fact that there are so many people who are thinking along similar lines. I have to go several hundred miles, for example, to talk to another writer from where I teach. Certainly the natural environment is, from my point of view, very, very pleasing. You hear a grouse go out beside you when you're walking back to your room. It's just very pleasant. At the same time, the natural environment, I think, is deceptive, insofar as simply because of the natural environment, people tend to believe that somehow they're going to be suddenly creative. And you discover very quickly that that's not true, that the natural environment is pleasant and distractive, pleasantly distractive. But there's no necessary connection, shall I say, between the beauty of the rural setting, of the pastoral setting, and creative endeavor. Perhaps the bread loaf in that sense plays on a kind of pastoralism, a Wordsworthian pastoralism, where if you will walk through the flowers and the trees and that you will suddenly be inspired. And I don't know that that's true. It seems to me the artist is most often inspired when he's perhaps least distracted by the things around him. At the same time, I think there are others that I, shall I say, criticize that sense of the natural setting. I also believe that the natural setting provides a good situation for people to meet each other. You can have conversations here, for example, without being interrupted by other people, without a lot of noise, without a lot of confusion around you. This room, for example, we're sitting in right now, you can, in fact, escape from other people and have a very intimate relationship with some other people. It seems to me that that is valuable. The size of the campus, if nothing else, is conducive to that. By and large, I think that writers' conferences are a very strange experience. It reminds me of a spring, in fact, that begins to be wound very tight, very loose at the beginning, I mean, and in fact is wound tighter and tighter and tighter until the 2.5 weeks are over, and suddenly it breaks and all the pieces go back home.
Sometime during the second week of the conference, after the lectures and while the workshop clinics are going on, the members of the conference known as contributors, those who have passed in manuscript, have individual conferences with the staff members who have read their manuscripts. I may say this is a lot of work for the staff members. Each one reads about 10 manuscripts and has to arrange at least 10, often more, hours of individual conference in which the staff member, an established writer, goes over the manuscript submitted by the conference member and tries to point out its weaknesses. He has no contract to praise. Sometimes he finds it possible to praise. I feel that the contract has been fulfilled when the weakness of the writing has been analyzed and demonstrated to the author, who then has a responsibility of his own to find out how to improve it. What the staff member, what the conference member gets out of this is an opportunity that's rare. Where would he go in what we call the real world outside Bread Loaf to get an established author to take the time to read his novel manuscript or his manuscript of a book of poems and to put in his time and attention and try to point out to him what he has done badly and what he might hopefully do to improve the manuscript?
I know exactly the things you're saying are things I do consider when I write it. And
Yes.
I just had a block on this story because
Yes.
of its being autobiographical, and I was having a hard time
Maybe it's...
distinguishing between a way to write and being precise about what I wanted to say. You know?
It might be that you don't have it really clearly in focus yourself.
Probably I
In the
don't,
workshop
yeah.
yesterday, we discussed writing a paragraph, maybe 2 or 3 sentences, of exactly where you think you're going in the story, where you want to go, and your characters clearly in mind, and the point of view. Geneva doesn't really come through to me as an individual, as a person. Over here, you get kind of bogged down in the making of these costumes, and it's fuzzy to me. It isn't clear-cut. I'd like to see this probably cut down to about half and just click right along. Actually, I brought a couple of things here, because I can illustrate this better by using someone else's work. To me, this is a story that's very much in focus right in the beginning. There once was a boy, a young boy, and his name was Kid. He lived far out in the country in a little house that was surrounded by vines and bushes and tall, scraggly weeds. Once Kid's grandfather had lived there too, but now the boy was alone. She's got that all in focus. She has her conflict out there. You get the whole picture of Kid in his context, where he lives. Then this goes on. In spring, Kid liked to wander through the woods and watch chipmunks chattering among the rocks and squirrels playing in the high oaks. So that on the second page then it gets into the story, but it comes very clearly into focus in that beginning one. Even in this, The Little Prince. I just happened to pick this up today. I love this story.
Yeah.
And in the very first paragraph, he says, once when I was 6 years old, I saw a magnificent picture in a book called True Stories from Nature about the primeval forest. It was a picture of a boa constrictor in the act of swallowing an animal. Here is a copy of the drawing.
Well, it really is an incredible 2 weeks. In the first place, or the last place, having a camera sitting on my bed with me was not quite the beginning when I started to apply to come up here. But I'm here originally as a contributor in poetry, which means that I submitted a manuscript, and the manuscript was reviewed by someone, and someone said, okay, someone else will read it. But the outlines in the catalog, if you want to call it that, really do not get at the dimensions of this experience, in that it's true that there certainly are lectures to attend that range in varying degrees of really from the academic to approach to really very useful workshop sessions in which at one point 2 of my poems were presented for open discussion, and other of the contributors here had their work looked at by participants, and then of course the really main point theoretically in being here was the conference with my critic, which was very useful. And I guess because having been here for 7 days before my conference, I was either relaxed enough or jazzed up enough or something to be able really to hear what she was saying. And the final product or the final effect for me will be in the next few months if I am able to turn the corner a little bit in my own writing when I get back to Boston and back out of this lovely 2 weeks.
Now, you said you had another poem
Yes.
that for you was more poetic. Why don't we look at that for a minute
right.
for comparison?
Now, this has no title. Who is the woman I never met who should have proved my one true love? Is she, too, arid with regret, in a yak hair tent, perhaps, in cold Tibet, her peasant husband squatting near the stove? She lives, or may have lived and died in a sequestered spot of earth. I never found her, though I've tried for 60 years, come Eastertide, a holy mandate given me at birth. I searched for promise in many eyes, in field and factory, cart and train.
That's beautiful, that line right there. To me, that's poetry.
I searched for promise.
I searched for promise in many eyes, and then it goes in field and factory, cart and train, where you'd least expect someone, you'd least expect that to follow the next line. I think that's a beautiful transition. Go ahead.
I'll go back to the beginning of that stanza. I searched for promise in many eyes, in field and factory, cart and train, and groped for proof in random thighs, and married twice to vouch for lies, and read Timaeus many times in vain. I have no wish to find her now. There's nothing we could do but dream of joys that might have been, since how can aged bodies ever know true love? I only want to hear her name.
I think there are a couple of cliches in that poem that, you know, it's an interesting idea to explore, that there might be one person in the world that would be the perfect match, right? A tantalizing idea to explore. And it's in some ways it's a parody on that whole kind of romantic song notion of my one true love. And at the same time, it's almost a metaphysical notion. And I think that you have to be careful. You start in a rather humorous vein, and the rhymes, I think, reinforce your slightly ironic, if not humorous, tone. And I assume that that was meant to cut the inherent sentimentalism of the subject. But even when you end, even if you mean true love, ironically, I think you've come close enough to actually discussing the subject to make us not quite take it entirely ironically, which weakens it. I think this poem would be stronger to either exist on a more emotional level of really trying to talk about that concept, and of course what aging has to do with the alteration of that concept, or to make it even wittier and even less possibly a serious discussion. I mean, sometimes when you elevate these things to the level of complete wit and facetiousness, you get the reader to take you actually more seriously. Once he's enjoyed all the wit and so forth, he walks away actually thinking about the idea. And for me, the poem could be either heightened to wit, or toned down to more metaphysical approach.
I see.
What do you think, Mphahlele?
Again, I found this much more musical. I listen. You think of the meaning of poems, and I listen to the music in it. And I find this a great improvement over the last in the rhythm. Is she, too, arid with regret in a yak hair tent, perhaps in cold Tibet? Even though it's a rhyme, it has a nice rhythm to it. I don't like her peasant husband squatting near the stove. That seems to break the music of it.
Consistent with life in Tibet.
I don't like the word sequestered.
I had some agonies about that too.
I don't know what you could replace it. I would work on
that's a cliche, sequestered spot.
more on images and rhythm, because it's beginning in this poem. And I think that would make the idea, which is a cliche, into something more beautiful, because even the simplest cliche can be made beautiful with the right words and rhythm and beat.
Well, I think that there is a serious problem of tone in this poem, that until you decide whether you want the tone to be witty or you want the tone to be serious, which is not to say that it couldn't be both, but on the surface I think it ought to be one or the other, that kind of alternating in your own mind, all that does is crack the tone when you have set it up in one way, and then force the reader to go back and start thinking in another way, and that destroys the initial facade of the poem for me.
Bread Loaf does not stress the marketing of writing. The conference is not a success school, but a meeting of people seriously interested in good writing. Every year, however, a number of publishers, magazine editors, and agents turn up at the conference, and once in each session we present them as a panel and let the conference members fire questions at them about contracts, ways of submitting a manuscript, how to find a good literary agent, and all such details of the marketplace.
What percentage would you say of books published in the United States are dreamed up by the editors and the author then found for them?
Non-fiction, of course, a very large number, I should imagine.
No, this would not be true of novels.
But I was going to remark that with the quarterly, it is a very rare month, or a very rare issue that appears, that an author, maybe 2 or 3 of them, get letters from commercial publishers asking perhaps to see more of their work, if they write short stories, asking to see a novel if they have a novel, or something of this sort. So this is one way to become known to larger sorts of publishers, both in magazine and book fields.
I translated a Spanish short story from Spanish for the Arizona Quarterly some time ago, and shortly thereafter got a letter from Alfred Knopf saying, could you put us in touch with the man who wrote this story you translated? We're interested in seeing if we can translate a whole book of his work, which I think is not a rare incident, that they do find in the little magazines the sort of thing they're looking for.
Right.
I think for magazine articles, I'd feel more comfortable with something like 50%, John, than perhaps 70. But it's different, I think.
Well,
book publishing. You'll find among magazines, I think, this would be an interesting thing to try to verify, that the most vigorous magazines are the most open to outside contributions and do not have so many house-originated ideas, do not have so much staff writing, do not have a stable of writers that tends to give them a sameness. Now, one thing that got the Saturday Evening Post in trouble, I think, was it went this route. It had a stable of people and a bunch of staff people, and it, instead of having national coverage and more variety as it used to have, I think it got a little bit trapped that way. Well, so that's easy to have happen.
I disagree with your analysis of the griefs of the Saturday Evening Post, but I don't think they're relevant here. Let's throw this open as the nuts and bolts sessions. What questions would you like to ask about how you submit manuscripts? I mean, get as specific as you like. How do you type them? How do you address them? Do you or don't you include a stamped addressed envelope? How do you, will you be read? Anything that, yes.
2 quick questions. Number 1, I take it that it's poor form to address a letter to the editor, dear sir, but which editor when a list is given to you? And second of all, when you submit a manuscript and the weeks start ticking by and you get no acknowledgement, what's the next line of attack?
Well, I'll give you my answer, and maybe the others as well. I do my best not to read the letters that accompany manuscript. I think they're irrelevant. They're only going to say, how nice it was seeing you in Peoria, or please give me a critique, which I haven't got time to give them and couldn't give them by mail anyhow. Besides which, as much as possible, I don't want to know the name of the person I'm reading until I've come to a judgment. Now, sometimes the name is right under the title, and you can't avoid seeing it, but wherever it's possible, I like to cover the name and read the writing as writing. And it's always exciting, having decided, hey, I like this poem, to take the hand off the page and find a name you've never seen before. That's a real reward. Now, I must confess, I am very rough with tinkly poems. If a poem begins, when I was a baby upon my mammy's knee, I'm not going to read any further. It's not going to get any better, take my word for it. And if there are 10 poems attached to that batch of manuscript, I'm not going to read any more. I will not publish any work by an author whose poems begin, when I was a baby upon my mammy's knee. I'm through with it. Now, I don't care what is in the letter. That goes into an outbasket. My secretary attaches a rejection slip, and I'm through. The time to put attention into it is a poem that you really like but spot a couple of technical flaws in, And then you might end up writing 6 or 7 letters to the author saying, I can't tell you how to write your poem, but this strikes me, and would you put it through your attention and see how it seems to you? Because there's so much I like in this poem, but I'm bothered by this, and how do you feel? And there might be a long exchange of letters there, and I would say that about 25% of the poems I published in the Saturday Review have been altered in some minor way as a result of this correspondence. That's where my time belongs, not exchanging sweet little letters with people who may be large human beings but are lousy writers. Now, your second question, how long should you wait? That depends. When Edward Weeks was editor of The Atlantic, somebody had a memo reading hold for weeks, and somebody had scratched it out and changed it to hold for months. I have had manuscripts at the Atlantic Monthly for as much as 16 months before Weeks got around to it. And every once in a while, when I take off on a trip somewhere, the mail isn't looked at for 2 or 3 months. I'm not happy about that. I'd be much happier if it happened always within a couple of weeks. But you learn that the New Yorker is fairly fast and the Atlantic Monthly is fairly slow and so forth, and you make your psychic adjustments accordingly.
Did you have any did it turn out well that this form of the black woman as a pillar came out on the page as a pillar of words?
Do you realize that that is something you just brought to my attention?
Oh, well, you see.
And I was curious about why you asked about pillar, and then I responded about the matriarchy and what have you. And now you bring me to this at this particular point in time. I had not really considered that. And look at this. And maybe it's because the poem does continue on the other side that I've been reading over. And that would interrupt the pillar image, I think.
But it's this is so much better use of form than when you got carried away by the rhymes and that other poem. All of the forms that are any good for us, I think, are organic and kind of unique and hover on the uncertainties that the poem is hovering on. So when you start pounding with rhymes like that, you better have a marching song.
Well, you know, really, I don't like rhyme. I don't like rhyming. I'd rather deal with free verse. I feel that I should try to deal with rhyme and go through all that which they tried to teach me in high school and some courses in college. But that would only be when I had complete time relaxation to deal with it and conquer it and then go on into free verse like I want to. I just feel that I owe it to myself to deal with rhyme and work it out and then move into what I feel more comfortable with.
Have you read much poetry that's rhymed?
Not really, just from high school.
Yeah.
Just from high school.
They teach you pretty dull poems that rhyme?
Well, I guess they would teach the regular, classic poets, Shakespeare, Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley. That's what I dealt with insofar as poetry is concerned. And then you get into, of course, limericks and all that kind of stuff in some classes. But no, they didn't really.
I noticed when you were putting down, as we all do, I guess, one way or another, the traditional poets, you named some pretty good ones along with the others, and what we all feel is, whether they're good or bad, they can't teach you how to write a poem now, unless you're completely historically oriented, which I'm not, and you're probably not. You have to learn to make the poem of the time. And I guess what I thought was wrong with your rhymed poems and your formula poems is that that particular gift that each of us has to make our own insight verbal gets sidetracked when you're trying to do a routine. The poems that have positions. No, I can't write better a poem that Robert Frost has written, and you can't write better a poem that Leroy Jones has written, but you can write a poem that neither of them could have written.
I'm really happy with the conference. I thought many of the lectures were helpful. I had never had my work criticized before in such depth. I've never had so many suggestions made as to how I can improve it. And this is something that every writer needs. There's a friend of mine in Michigan who claimed all writers need other writers, and this has been good.
In addition, Bradshaw had lost his virginity in the records room of the alumni magazine to an aggressive, if flat-chested, Cornell co-ed, had since become engaged 3 times to different girls. He had met a lot of these girls. Always they were the kind who refused to let him make the first contact, but who approached him on the premise that something was wrong with him. His button-down shirt wasn't buttoned down, or he had a spot on his forehead, or he was getting a cold, or looked sad, or about something. Furthermore, between the first contact and the first jocular reference, theirs, to marriage, they became ticklish, giggly, and inclined to interpret Bradshaw's every gesture as a sexual threat. Once sitting next to a girl at a beach, he lifted his hand to scratch his chin, and she cried out instantly, "Don't touch." After some seconds of baffled consideration, he concluded that she meant not his chin, but her bare knee, which was a good 8 inches away. Invariably, there came a time when he and the girl held a sober conversation about their relationship. This was the signal for the girl to change on the spot into a wanton. How are you going to reconcile the usual genre, the James Bond type of adventure, with a man that seems to have all my hang-ups and all my neuroses?
Well, I was hoping to work out perhaps a bit of humor in the contrast between these adventures and his reactions. He is incompetent. He's no hero at all. He's an anti-hero. He's perhaps even less than an anti-hero. And I saw this as a device for perhaps getting some funny writing in. I don't really know if it'll work, however.
Well, the thing that disturbed me a little in reading it is that there is an accepted genre, this type of writing.
Yeah.
And the hero that we have come to recognize is a man who is capable of nearly everything.
Yeah.
He flies over buildings, and he does all the things that Houdini and Jack Armstrong would do. Well, he isn't that kind of a man, and yet these things are going to happen. These things indeed do happen to him.
Right, right.
And the thing that I worry about is whether there's going to be an acceptance on the part of the reader that the fellow, the man that we identify with, not Sean, whatever his name is, the fellow in the James Bond movie, but the man that the ordinary guy can identify with would be believed in these circumstances.
One of the most remarkable human beings I know, and one of the most joyously met men within my recent experience, is Ezekiel Mphahlele, who will lecture tonight. Ezekiel, Zeke as we call him, was born in South Africa under that tremendous burden of apartheid, brought up in a location, as it is called, actually a sort of rural slum outside of Pretoria, with no rights, no privileges under the law. He managed, because of something that is in him, to get a bachelor's degree and a master's degree by mail. He was not allowed to attend the colleges on his own, by correspondence school. He became a newspaper man and escaped from South Africa just before he was to be arrested for treason. The treason consisted of saying a few human things in an article about the blacks in South Africa. He went to Nigeria, across the border from South Africa, if I have the geography right, and from there on to other schools. He speaks French fluently, German, Afrikaans, and of course English. He won his doctoral degree from the University of Denver, where he now teaches.
Before writing the autobiography, I had been writing short stories for at least 10 years. I just wrote and stacked them up, read the masters of the form, and wrote, not caring that no publisher would condescend to look at them because all publishers are white. The first magazine to publish my stories was founded by a white man, primarily for the African readership in 1950. The stories of Richard Wright and Langston Hughes did a lot to keep the fire alive in me. It looked as if the vitriol I was pouring out into my fiction were inexhaustible. There seemed to be a liberal leak of gall pouring into my system. So when I got to my autobiography, I did feel that my system had been poisoned. and I actually felt it physically and emotionally. So you see, I needed to write a kind of autobiography. I wanted to write to effect a kind of therapy. For this, I had deliberately to avoid self-pity. I had to do this without seeming to reconcile or forgive. Who can reconcile? Who can forgive? He has driven me against the wall so that I never forget I am black. He has taught me to lie to him and feel triumphant. Because he has made me to get used to the back door, I have bought goods stolen from his shop by his own black worker for less than the cost. And there are millions of me. We know almost everything about him, and he knows nothing about us. So we still hold the trump card. It is the lingering melody of a song that moves me more than the initial experience itself. It is the lingering pain of a past insult that rankles and hurts me more than the insult itself. Too dumb to tell you how immensely this music or that play or this film moves me. I wait for the memory of the event. For the moment, I'm still baffled, and my canoe still feels the momentum that launched it in 2nd Avenue. But what a glorious sense of release. Yep.
Once a person gets it into his head that writing might indeed be pleasant, well, what can I say except that with the attitude changed for the better, a certain inhibition may be lifted. And indeed, this is the significance of Bread Loaf Writers Conference. Not that it performs some sort of magic that builds up genius out of raw material. No, indeed. What it does is to bring you for 2 weeks into a community of writers and would-be writers. For 2 weeks, I feel it ought to be for 2 years. For 2 weeks, it surrounds you not with people who go about their run-of-the-mill jobs, doing whatever it is they do, but people who, like you, consider the typewriter their primary tool, who, like you, have something going on in the inside of their heads, whether for better or for worse, who, like you, have the infernal gall to want their words to be read by others, to see their name upon their productions. For 2 weeks, you discuss problems, you feel a kind of union. For 2 weeks, you have a feeling that the world belongs to you. You are in your world. And at the end of the 2 weeks, you go out not with increased genius, not even with increased talent, just with increased confidence that the work you're doing is important, that there are others who recognize importance, that you are treated with respect, that whether you succeed or not, the endeavor is noble. And once you learn that, whether you ever get there or not in a commercial sense, you will have gotten there as far as your own pleasure, your own feeling is concerned. And really, that is all you have a right to ask.
I don't think I'll ever come to another conference. I'm glad I came to this one. Because I think what you do alone, you know, just like you die alone or you're born alone. I think you really do it alone. And it's good to see other people who are also, you know, to come together and talk and see other people who are also will go home and do it alone. And I think next time I sit down at the typewriter, instead of feeling that I am completely alone, you know, against this white space, this white blankness, to make meaning out of the universe, I'll realize that somewhere there's Elaine, there's Barry, there's Mike, there's Si, that are also, you know, alone, but doing the same thing.
This is Bread Loaf. Over the years, the conference has developed patterns of its own, but there are no hard-set formulae. There is a basic conversation begun by the staff lecturers and carried on by the conference members all day and far into the night. That is all there is, but there is a secret. and the secret is isolation. Bread Loaf is like a landlocked cruise. Nothing intrudes on the basic conversation. The result is an intensity that is unique to the Bread Loaf experience.